Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this conversation, we're excited to welcome Alana Lentin back to the show to talk about her new book, The Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy, which works with the concept of the racial regime put forth by Cedric Robinson in his book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. The book features a foreword by Cedric Robinson's wife and longtime interlocutor and partner in critical media work, Elizabeth Robinson. We talk about this book project, which starts with an analysis of the war on so-called critical race theory and the attendant fascistic agenda, the whitelash against Black studies, and gets deep into Zionist counterinsurgency efforts throughout academia and beyond, as well as the so-called war on anti-Semitism, and how we make sense of, quote, the processes through which radical colonial rule is ideologically resecured, end quote. It's a really interesting read, and I definitely recommend people pick it up. Alana Lentin is a teacher and writer, and is a Jewish European woman who is a settler on Gadigal Wengal land, or so-called Sydney, Australia. Her work focuses on a critical theorization of race, racism, and anti-racism. She is a professor of cultural and social analysis at Western Sydney University. She is the author and editor of multiple books, including Why Race Still Matters and Racism and Anti-Racism in Europe. This is also the first episode that Josh and I have recorded together since, I believe, October of 2023, so it was great to collaborate again on an episode. There are a few episodes I'll include in the show description that relate to this conversation directly or tangentially, or are cited in this conversation, but I do want to highlight an emergency live stream that we hosted with the Samir Project last week. With the forced starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, it is absolutely critical that we find ways to continue getting support their way. We will put a link to the Samir Project and that conversation in the show description. I also just want to quickly plug two things. There's a series that Mtume Gant and I did on Forgeries of Memory and Meaning that people can check out if they want to read along with that book, or just hear our chapter-by-chapter analysis of it. And additionally, Mtume, who's the host of Within Our Gates podcast, and I have launched a series that we are hosting weekly on the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism YouTube page that's called The Imperial 80s, where we look at the most imperialist films of the 1980s and how these films shaped our consciousness growing up in the imperial core at a time of heightened anti-communist and pro-imperialist propaganda, much like the moment we are in now. And of course, if you appreciate the work that we do on audio podcasts like this and through our video feed on YouTube, the best way to support our work is to become a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month, or support us through our Buy Me a Coffee page. Our music, as always, is courtesy of Televangel. Now, here is our conversation with Alana Lentin on the new racial regime. All right, so Alana Lentin, welcome back to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It has been, the last conversation we had was not long after October 7th, 2023, but then
November.
On the audio side, it's a couple years back. Was that 2021 or 2022?
I want to say 2022 with Michael Richmond and Alex Charnley as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Yeah. So really good to be back with you. It was a lot of fun to read this book. I think you set the record, I'm sure you did, to date at least, for the most Millennials Are Killing Capitalism footnotes in a book. So we appreciate that a lot. And it's been great. We've had you a part of study groups and, collaborated in a lot of ways over the years. So it's really cool to see that kind of take form in this really neat new book that you've published, The New Racial Regime. So I'm going to start with the preface and just a line that stood out to me from it. One I've certainly come across before, but probably didn't resonate in quite the same way that it does in this particular moment, which is it's a part of you quote a little bit longer piece, but it's a statement from Cedric Robinson about the Black radical tradition, in which he states, "It is not the province of one people to be the solution or the problem, but a civilization maddened by its own perverse assumptions and contradictions is loose in the world," end quote. And I mean, I appreciate, what he's trying to talk about in terms of the Black radical tradition and that and everything else. But that particular line, a civilization maddened by its own perverse assumptions and contradictions is loose in the world, really stuck with me, I think as kind of the best framing I can kind of imagine for what we've seen so starkly thrown into relief over the last couple of years. I know you started this project before the anti-colonial revolt of October 7th, as you recognize it in the book.
Yeah.
And obviously the genocidal, war that Israel, with the full support of this so-called Western civilization has engaged in since then. So what are some of the ways that this project evolved for you after October 7th, 2023?
Thanks, Jared, and thanks, Josh, for having me. It's true that this book in many ways couldn't have been written without Millennials are Killing Capitalism. So yes, there are many references to your podcast and the YouTube channel in the book. It's interesting. I wrote the prologue just before, as you do, sending the manuscript in, the final kind of submission of the manuscript. And as I'm sure we're going to get into it, a lot of this book has been informed by my engagement with Cedric Robinson over the last, let's say, 5 years, particularly the last 3 years, I think, but starting a bit earlier. And I always find that when you go into Robinson, you find the thing that's going to really be necessary for you in that moment. And so obviously putting this prologue together, you find this at the end of Black Marxism. And yes, you're right, the genocide throws this into relief. But really, I think when we think about all of the discussions that people have been having around racial capitalism since Robinson's death, and it's been noted by many scholars of Robinson that it was very sad in many ways that his scholarship wasn't taken up as much as it was after his transition in 2016. People were grappling with trying to understand what racial capitalism is. And really, when we look deeply at what it's trying to do, it's really trying to grapple with those contradictions and madnesses of Western civilization and its hold over the entire world for the last at least 500 years, although we could discuss the dates. And so what was happening to me in writing this book was that I had to think very clearly about what events that were unfolding before our eyes, which were all part and parcel of the deep subjects of the book, but we're just being laid bare and what I could do with that. So just to step back from those more kind of conceptual considerations and to think really where I was when I was writing this book, a little bit the story of it, if you like, is that I wrote my last book, or I published my last book, Why Race Still Matters, which we discussed, I guess, 3 years ago now on the podcast. It came out in 2020. And almost as soon as it came out, you'll remember COVID, George Floyd uprisings, the movement for Black Lives, etc. And you have this mooting on the right, the critical race theory, which is really not something that people in the public domain knew anything about or had, ever discussed, was responsible for everything that was wrong in the world. And Donald Trump started to, he actually passed an executive order just at the end of his last presidency, banning the use of critical race theory within kind of the federal government and so on. And so people started to talk about these attacks on critical race theory. And so what I wanted to do at that point was just maybe to write, obviously I just published a book. I didn't want to do another big project straight away. I thought I'll do a short kind of essay-like response to this war on critical race theory. And what was really interesting was that I kind of put it out there, and it was really hard to kind of find a home for it initially. And one of the things that came up in conversation, which I mentioned in the prologue, is that people said to me, yeah, but by the time you sit down, you write this book, you do the research and it comes out, nobody's going to be talking about this anymore. And I was like, okay, that's very interesting, considering that this is just a kind of a recursive effect of the ongoing the ways in which race is constantly being denied in public discourse and kind of hegemonically. And so time passed, and eventually, I did get a contract with Pluto to write this book. But because of that lag of time, a number of things happened. Firstly, other people obviously wrote about the war on critical race theory. In fact, David Theo Goldberg has a book of that title. And I also started to see that it was insufficient just to treat this in a kind of a piecemeal way. And at the same time, through my engagement with Robinson, and particularly his last book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, which I'm sure we'll get into, I started to think about this in terms of the racial regime. And sort of interestingly, at the same time, Robin Kelly did an interview on Conjuncture Pod in which he literally said that the war on woke was an example of the racial regime. And then what happened? So I started writing the book, and I wrote, I think, the introduction and the first two chapters, which the first two chapters deal with the war on critical race theory. And then the genocide started. Tufan al-Aqsa, October 7th, 2023. And of course, Israel's and the West's immediate genocidal response to that uprising, that anti-colonial uprising. And so I came to the end of 2023 with half the book written and a plan for the book, which was always going to include an engagement with the politics of anti-Semitism and their usages for racial rule, as we'll get into, I'm sure. And obviously, when you were discussing this, you need to talk about Zionism. You need to set that in the context of Zionism, because that's what we're dealing with when we talk about the war on anti-Semitism. But I obviously didn't know that we were going to be confronting this genocide. And then everything had to kind of take a turn in a sense. And so you'll see that the book is kind of in two parts, although I hope I've made it cohere. But I think the point is that everything that I was kind of leading up to in that book really threads through or connects to everything that the genocide has shown us. And so the example, so the discussion in chapter 3 about the epistemological problems with critical race theory, for example, was laid bare by the fact that certain prominent critical race theorists refused to talk about the genocide and didn't connect it to the practices of critical race theory and the need to defend critical race theory and indeed all kind of academic and all kind of public discussion of race, be it in schools, be it in the media and so on. Very kind of strident statements made, as I get into a little bit in the book, by, say, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw about, the demise of critical race theory or the attack of critical race theory at the same time that she, as holding chairs at both Columbia and UCLA, two sites of extreme violence during the student encampments, has literally not spoken a word publicly about the genocide. So, I could go on, but that's kind of what happened in terms of the trajectory of how the book came to be so prominently dealing with the politics of Palestine.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, so we should try to clear this up. To give you a minute to talk about the racial regime, what it is, and how you understand it via Cedric Robinson, and how you use the concept in your book as well.
Okay, thanks. So, let's, I already mentioned a little bit about Cedric Robinson and how important his work is for the whole kind of, structure of this book and the whole thinking behind this book and the way I connect it to, as I said first, the war on critical race theory and how that kind of segues into a whole heap of other questions about the many practices of race and racial rule. And having engaged relatively deeply with Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition, the book that he's best known for, and, in fact, the study group that you led, Jared, really helped me in many ways. Although I'd even taught that book before, I think it took that study group for it to kind of really, make sense in many ways in a deeper sense. And at the same time, I was engaging with his last book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, which is a book about the representation of Black people through theatre and film, and particularly American film at a very precise moment in historical time. And I think it's Josh Myers in his biography of Cedric Robinson that mentions that Avery Gordon, who was a colleague, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, I can't exactly remember, but she was a colleague of Robinson's at UC Santa Barbara, said to him, you've got to write a preface where you actually explain what you mean by the racial regime. And that's why you get this preface, which is only a few pages long at the beginning of this book, in which he sets out this notion of the racial regime, which is really, really useful way for thinking about the way in which essentially how racial capitalism is reproduced. So we think about racial capitalism as this historical force. He locates it in Black Marxism, in the history of European feudalism, and you get a very good kind of analysis of how important racialism, as he calls it, is for the kind of propelling forth of capitalism throughout, modern world history. But you don't really get a sense in that work, although you get it in a whole host of essays, for example, the essays and talks and lectures that are collected in the collective volume on racial capitalism that Pluto put out, edited by H.L.T. Kwan. And I'm sure in other writings in the archives. I mean, you and I both, Jared, were at the conference that was organized last year to inaugurate the Cedric and Elizabeth Robinson archives. And I know that there's a whole host of materials in there that, haven't even been really engaged with by that many people. Although you get a sense of them a little bit in Josh Myers' work, both in the biography of Robinson and also in his later book of Black Study. Anyway, we know particularly through the essays, that Robinson was fascinated by film and media, particularly in sort of the 1990s. And apparently he was working on Forgeries of Memory and Meaning for about 20 years. And so in this book, where he delves into how cinema becomes a vehicle for representing a certain version of the United States at a particular historical juncture at the end of the 19th century, when he says a new racial regime coheres around whiteness and nationalism at a time when the US kind of has fully captured, if you like, Turtle Island. So the continent is settled and indigenous people have been contained despite many rebellions and uprisings and anti-colonial resistance that is rarely actually spoken about. You have this turn of the United States towards imperialism at this moment at the end of the 19th century. And this kind of coheres with a time of technological advances when you get the possibility for cinema to be evolved and for those technologies of representation to be used in ways to represent Black, Indigenous and colonized peoples in ways that kind of justify their domination in very particular ways. And this serves the needs of imperialism, American nationalism and capitalism at this time, and continue to do so to date. Now, as I mentioned in the preface, which is only about 5 or 6 pages long, he lays out this idea of the racial regime. So he writes in the preface, the racial regimes are constructed social systems in which race is proposed as a justification for relations of power. And then he says, the covering conceit of a racial regime is a makeshift patchwork masquerading as memory and the immutable. So he uses stitching metaphors a lot and this idea of patchwork. And you get this idea of the racial regime in this process of constant, as he puts it, recalibration or readjustment or recursivity in response constantly to resistance from below. And so there's this kind of motion that is constantly in existence because what is ultimately being portrayed is, as he puts it, a forgery or a fiction. So we know race, the entire idea of race is immutable difference between groups of ostensibly naturally different or biologically different or inherently culturally different human beings is an entire figment of sort of dominant imagination. But nonetheless, it's a very, very powerful one for reasons that we can get into. I know that there's a question later on that kind of looks at this to a certain extent. But nonetheless, because it's so obvious, particularly obviously to the people who are targeted by racism and racialism, that this is an entirely invented kind of imaginary that's used to dominate them, they're obviously going to resist that. And it's in response to this constant cycle of resistance and rebellion that the racial regime needs to be adjusted and readjusted. So the way that I've used this is beyond, because, I'm not a media studies scholar or a film studies person. I'd love to see, and in fact, we organized a symposium in London a couple of weeks ago now on racial regimes, where we had theatre scholars, for example, talking about how we can use racial regimes in theatre studies. And there's so much work that still needs to be done, I think, using this incredibly powerful concept and methodology in order to do just huge amounts of work. But that's not what I do. I don't do film studies and I don't do media studies. So I've used the racial regime to explain or to think with or think through the character of race as a technology for the management of human difference, which is the way I defined it in my last book, the character of that in this particular time of the early 2020s. So it's a kind of a history of the present, as Stuart Hall would put it. And this idea of recalibration, which again, is not, as Robinson explains, it's not wholesale change. So the racial regime is never completely new. Rather, it is renewed or restitched from, as he puts it, old cloth and new together. That's the power of it, because it uses things that are familiar to us and stitches them together and makes them relevant to processes in the present, and essentially confuses us. So one of the things that Robinson says is that race, unlike, he criticizes Foucault in this quite lovely kind of remark at the very, very start and the first page of the book. And he says, Foucault kind of tells us that everything is a total institution, and he doesn't quite say it like this, I'm paraphrasing. But, actual history is a hell of a lot more chaotic, right? And it's this chaos actually that is the thing that confuses us and allows race to, or the racial regime, to be recalibrated in ways that continue to dominate.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Forgeries. I mean, Mtume and I, and you referenced this, but I know we started it right as you were turning it in.
Yeah, shame, yeah.
But we spent way too much time reading through that book and talking about it. But it's great. I mean, that is a really, I do now totally understand why, Elizabeth Robinson said she wants more people to focus work around that book. It's hard to say what's somebody's best work or whatever, but, you can tell it's something that he's written after he spent a lot of years really refining, his research and his skills in storytelling and all of that. And it's just, it's great.
And Josh Myers said at the symposium that we had the other week that it was his magnum opus. That was the title of his talk. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree. So anyway, related to this is, I hear Robin D.G. Kelly probably saying this a bit more. Robinson probably alludes to it as well, but you talk about it in the book as well as this claim of an inherent weakness of racial regimes. And you kind of laid that out in your response to the previous question, sort of chaotic nature of them responding to struggle and so on.
Yeah.
But I'm always really interested in this idea that they're weak. Obviously, I want them to be weak because, well, it is true that I've seen shifts, and we've all seen shifts, and I know we'll talk about some of them in my own lifetime. And, you look back historically at different periods and you can see even more shifts in how the racial regime is calibrated.
Yeah.
I think the issue I always have with the idea of weakness is that I also think in a book like Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, part of what he's showing is look, the really wealthy people, they kind of control Hollywood, and they have a lot of input into what gets spread there. And there are these kind of, it's not just top down. There are individual figures. Yesterday or the other day, Mtume and I did an episode on Rambo and Sylvester Stallone. And Sylvester Stallone's like a guy who writes his own scripts and so on. And you could see that with way Robinson deals with D.W. Griffith, for instance, right? So you have these figures that may not be a part of necessarily the ruling class that might come along and craft something that then becomes really useful for the ruling class. But I do think that because there is this capitalist control of the media, and obviously at the end of the day, the control of, the military, right, which we see, in terms of what's playing out in Gaza for sure, that I guess I sort of wonder what is useful about us understanding the weakness of racial regimes. And maybe if you have some examples of how you think this plays out and times that racial regimes have been defeated and what that process looks like for you.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's so interesting to think about it in relation to the questions that are so alive for us today around why there is this top-down mandatory Zionism that's being imposed on populations that, ostensibly on the face of things should have nothing to do with what's happening in the Middle East, which I'm sort of parroting the rhetoric of the right when they say, why are you concerned so much with what's happening? So, particularly in Australia, which is geographically very far away, they'll say, well, why are we talking about something that's 16,000 kilometers away when we have our own issues here, without, really connecting how Zionist logics as settler colonial logics are so relevant to everything that happens in this particular settler colony. But, the kind of the debates that arise from that are things like, well, should we be focusing, and I talk about this in the book, I think in chapter 3, I've been influenced by Max Eil on this, for example. Should we be specifying more the role of Zionism for Western imperialism? Or should we be thinking more in terms of a lobby that controls and dictates what happens within other states in relation to this question, which is, of course, the debate around, you know, the role of the Zionist lobby. And it's always a tension because on the one hand, yes, very clearly, there are individuals and groups who are making it their business to instill into law and policy mandatory Zionism as a way to deflect from the genocide, not just this current phase of the genocide, but this basically century-long genocide of the Palestinian people in the name of establishing, you know, a Jewish state in Palestine. And at the same time, only looking and hyper-focalizing on, you know, what a particular group of people is doing to bring this about or to try to bring this about, takes the spotlight away from the wider structures that all of this is serving. But I would argue that you need to do both. And you need to do it in such a way where, while you recognize that there are particular individuals, and some of them I speak about in the book, who've made it their business to directly punish people. And we have a situation now in Australia where an envoy, so-called anti-Semitism envoy appointed by the government, who's, you know, a rabid Zionist, actually a migrant to Australia from South Africa, so that tells you a lot, is currently trying to instill a suite of policies that would effectively punish any and all speech on Palestine across the board, be it in universities, public institutions, cultural bodies, and you name it. And so I understand why people are focalizing on this particular person. And it's actually very interesting. It was found out in the course of the last week that her husband donated $50,000 to a far right-wing white supremacist sort of group in Australia that is opposed to any form of kind of Indigenous representation and even of the most kind of milquetoast, etc. And the argument that's being used by government representatives or the responsible minister, who's obviously has egg on his face, is that it would be misogynist to blame her for her husband's donations to the far right. So, you know, we can easily see how, anyway, I'm kind of going off topic. But, you know, what I'm trying to say is that there are individuals who are responsible, but they've been given, and this is why I wrote a short piece that I published on my Substack the other day called War is War. We'll get into what I call, following the Palestinian scholar Anna Yunus, the war on anti-Semitism. But I think we have to understand the role that these people and the organizations that they represent, that they play within this particular war, which is a war, I mean, to come back to your very first question, which is a war, as the German Prime Minister or German Chancellor said very clearly, is a war for the survival of Western civilization. And he said Israel is doing the dirty work of the West for it, right? And right at the beginning of the genocide, the Israeli President Herzog said this is a war for the survival or something of Western civilization, right? So the point then is to look at what role all of these people, D.W. Griffiths taking upon himself, right? Obviously, these people exist, right? People run institutions, but they're doing so within a particular logic. And I think then to look at the flip side of that and to think about this weakness, it's this weakness, that this inherent weakness of the ideas, which propel these individuals and institutions to kind of constantly adjust the ways in which things are being represented. And this is why you get so many seemingly conflicting ideas being rolled out for the benefit of maintaining or deepening or widening a racial regime. And as I'm sure we'll get into, I mean, you know, for example, the use of rhetoric of Indigenous self-determination as a central ploy of Zionists to put forth this absolutely noxious idea that Jews are indigenous to Palestine, of course, they would say Israel, is an example of how kind of ostensibly radical anti-colonial politics can be used in order to put forth kind of genocidal views. So my point is that the weakness is the strength, if you know what I mean. It's not that there's this inherent weakness and therefore, you know, we shouldn't be too worried or something about the role of these individuals and institutions. On the contrary, the weakness is what creates the strength. The chaos and the confusion is what creates the strength. And that's why it's all the more difficult to fight against them, because so many people can be easily, and again, like within the context of the overriding conditions of capitalism, where people are exhausted and people are having to make money to make ends meet and all the rest of it, but also people are confused literally by what's being put out in front of them. And, we see ostensibly left-wing people saying, well, to respond to the challenge from the right, we need more patriotism or we need more nationalism. That's a confusing position to people, right? Because of the fact that the dominant politics are nationalist ones, and so much of kind of liberal approaches to anti-racism have said, well, if we request or ask for more inclusion into the society, then racism might, meet its end and so on, then we can understand the attractiveness of that kind of idea, right? And then, putting that together with the entire assault on any kind of truthful representation of history and contemporary sociology when it comes to questions of race, class, capitalism, and imperialism, right? People are lacking knowledge. I'm not trying to say people are stupid, but there's a structural illiteracy that's been predetermined by the state and the media, and the work that you're currently doing on the YouTube around film and television and how that also confuses us. It's obvious, right, that we're in this situation.
Yeah, well, I want to follow up on that work because it's funny. I was rereading, going back through to prepare for, finalizing these questions, and I realized that you had talked about the Disney. Of course you would, because it would have made sense. The Disney, so-called DEI controversy and some of that. And we did talk about this a little bit. We did a 2-part conversation with Black Liberation Media, last Friday and Saturday as we're talking. Yeah. And this came up, and actually I had a Disney animator reach out to me to talk to me, which was really interesting, and hopefully something will come of that at some point. So talk a little bit, because you deal with this in the book. Just talk about the elements of it that you were interested in and what you think is important for us to kind of see within that example of the way Disney used DEI, the way Disney was attacked for using DEI, and all of this kind of stuff, and what was most interesting you about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was in the context of thinking about what was going on with this war on critical race theory, war on woke. And it's interesting. So it starts, because we haven't really got into that yet, but it starts with very much critical race theory, and then it kind of segues into woke, and these two things are kind of interchangeable to a certain extent, with all of the kinds of, policies like the Stop Woke Act in Florida and all this kind of thing. And of course, Disney being in Florida and DeSantis's direct attack on Disney, all of this stuff is going on in 2022. And so Disney becomes this very live concern. And I think it was the film The Little Mermaid that caused the biggest controversy. If you remember, they cast Halle, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, Halle Bailey, who's a Black actress, to play the role of the Little Mermaid. And this just caused, the right to have a complete, meltdown over it. And we saw these kind of ridiculous tracts being written about how it was impossible for a Black person to play a mermaid, which is a literal fictional character who lives under the sea. And in fact, my daughter reminded me that mermaids are supposed to be very ugly in old mythology, right? They're not supposed to be represented in this kind of beautiful, kind of ethereal way that they're being represented by Disney and others. But I mean, I wrote here in the book that, to try to respond to this ridiculous controversy, somebody wrote that not all sea creatures are white. Rainbow fish are not white. Orcas are not all white. Even whitefish are mostly black, brown, and green. As if we were going to have a serious conversation about these mythical characters. That led me to, come up with my favorite, little quip in the book about the epidermalization of fish, because I mean, what the hell are we talking about? But I think, okay, to come out of that and to think about what all of this means for Disney. I mean, obviously Walt Disney, and I think you get into this in your YouTubes on this, was a fascist, right? He was an admirer of Mussolini. He wined and dined the Nazi filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl who was a Nazi propagandist, during her US tour. And he was an anti-communist. And Disney as you've shown amply, I think is like at the bedrock of putting forth a particular vision of, the US's place in the world as this kind of benign kind of entity, at the same time as it's kind of, obviously at the vanguard of Western imperialism, and also this kind of anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, which is absolutely formative to the United States. It was interesting also to read about the documentary that was made by Abigail Disney, who's a descendant, I think she's the granddaughter of Disney, about worker relations at Disney and the complete exploitation of the regular worker who works within the company. And Gerald Horne and his work on this has also shown that this is a long-standing problem. So Disney has been anti-worker, anti-union since its inception. So obviously we have this anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-worker, anti-communist, pro-Nazi, pro-fascist, company that nonetheless is beloved of so many, people around the world, not just in the United States. So to speed up to kind of the post-George Floyd moment and this idea of this racial reckoning that the US was having to have because it keeps, the state keeps murdering Black people, and that Black people actually rose up against this, and that this also saw so much traction among people in the population at large, caused Disney to have to reevaluate some of its kind of older films that were so obviously racist and had been critiqued as being so for so long. And then it started to put kind of warnings or trigger warnings, I guess, under some of its films. And I think I quoted from it to say, these stereotypes, so stereotypes in movies like Dumbo, Peter Pan, or The Jungle Book, were wrong then and they are now. Instead of removing this content, we want to recognize its harmful impact, learn from it, and generate conversations to create a more inclusive future together. And this led, the right to kind of have a complete meltdown and say things like, are we shattering the American dream by, by Disney recognizing this thing? And also, I think policies that were rolled out at the company itself for workers to have kind of anti-racism training or DEI initiatives and so on and so forth. But obviously, I think what I want to say about all of this, because at the same time, and this was like, you had DeSantis, and Rufo, Christopher Rufo, architect apparently of the war on critical race theory, another noxious character who attacked Disney for woke capitalism, or for being a woke company, for falling into that. I didn't write about this, but I thought it was really interesting because there was this weird dovetailing of this criticism from the right of Disney and other companies for wokeness in reaction to, again, this so-called racial reckoning, which is not my terminology. I'm using it because that became dominant, and it's a horrible term as far as I'm concerned, and obviously completely meaningless. And at the time, there was a lot of kind of people saying, we have to be wary of how, capitalism whitewashes itself by using woke in order to kind of cover up its business as usual. And of course, I completely agree. And later on in chapter 3, I discuss companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon having unconscious bias training workshops and all this kind of stuff. Well, what I was thinking at the time is that, this doesn't mean that there's some kind of wholesale change within capitalism. This is something that can ease, and this is where the racial regime is a really, really useful idea to work with in order to see how this works. This can easily be taken away again, right? And indeed, as has come to pass very, very quickly, right, particularly in the context of the genocide, and I think under Biden, where this is idea that the administration is somehow good on racism, because I think Biden said the words institutional racism or systemic racism. So we're all good now kind of thing. And, and despite the fact that, so much of the Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement emerged under Obama. So what the hell are we talking about? So the point is that these responses, or this so-called woke capitalism, as soon as it's put in place, can easily be taken away again. And in fact, I think you mentioned yourselves that these warnings, these trigger warnings that Disney put in, have now kind of, been taken away. And all of these companies that made a big effort to, to show their wokeness or whatever that might look like for a brief few minutes in the couple of years after 2020, now no longer see any kind of need to do so. And that this genocide has given them the cover to be able to just forget that this was ever on the agenda.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that breakdown. So using Robinson's work, obviously, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, you draw this juxtaposition between Hollywood and the colonial and imperialist projects of the state. And you draw it in a way which I've also like come to this conclusion as well, where it seems so much more meticulous and deliberate almost, such as the military and economic domination over places like Hawaii or Haiti, and how these projects of colonial imperialist expansion had to be undergirded by a kind of, as you write, master narratives of social Darwinism and the civilizing mission, right? End quote. So this is, of course, where Hollywood was and is useful to the state, of course. And as you note, and I'm quoting here again, it provided a language to justify the colonial rampage and the subsequent labor exploitation, end quote. So I just would like for you to discuss this process more. And it's one that it can be observed. First of all, we just watch these films yourself, that you can see a lot of times the parallels happening in a lot of like the ideological maneuvering of the state and how it's being justified and kind of like the cultural apparatus from the state ultimately. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is what Robinson gets into in Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, particularly in the first chapter on the invention of the Negro, and is later kind of dealing with D.W. Griffiths. And I thought particularly interesting the jungle films genre. And he talks about how jungle films, I'm quoting here, rationalized a vision of a greater America to build on domestic colonization, which had settled down to a mundane protocol of exploitation. And this is the period of the early 20th century where the US has colonial ambitions, which had been declared, Robinson says, from the early days of the post-revolutionary United States. But just over a century later, military or economic domination over territories from Hawaii to Haiti began, bankrolled by capital. And he says that you had to have these kind of master narratives to massage these into public acceptance. And these master narratives were one of social Darwinism and the civilizing mission, which provided a language to justify colonial rampage and labor exploitation, as you quoted. And I loved how he talks about the role of the jungle films from D.W. Griffith's The Native Heart, which was 1901, to the Tarzan of the Apes movies, which were produced, it was a whole series of these movies that were produced between 1918 and 1948. And, I had a line in here which I subsequently took out because I'm not sure why, but it really connected with me because when I was growing up, and this is like how old I am, there were only about 4 channels on television. And they used to, on one of the channels, very often show these old black and white movies, which I used to love to watch. I used to mainly love to watch. Think about them now. Like if I was to watch them today, I'm sure I'd be horrified. But you remember all those kind of old movies, singing and dancing, and there were never any black people in them. If there were black people, maybe they were shining shoes or something like that, right? But one of the movies, that series of movies that they kept showing was Tarzan. And my brother and I had a line in there, how my brother and I used to watch these on a kind of a rainy Friday afternoon in Dublin. And then we'd run around the living room kind of like, imitating Tarzan doing the ape sound, like absolutely appalling, with no kind of understanding. And this is why I'm so grateful that at least young people today, like if I put on a movie, even from the early 2000s, and try to rewatch it with my daughter, who's 15, when she was already 8 or 9 years old, she'd say, "That's horrible. Switch it off. I can't watch this." I think she was like 10 when she said the words cultural appropriation. But anyway, we didn't know any of this stuff and we thought it was funny, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But the point is, actually, no, it's not off topic because, we would think like, what do 2 kids in Dublin have to do with the US's imperialist ambitions and the need to whitewash them? Well, everything, because of course, the domination of the US over the entire world system from this point on. And so it was necessary not only to project a particular image of Black and colonized people for the US domestic market, but also for the world in general in order to justify the kind of hegemony of US culture in homes, kind of everywhere, particularly in the West. I'm talking about at this time when, of course, this is before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So Robinson goes on to explain that Tarzan hit the screens at a time of global economic crisis. And this was also really important, I think, and it kind of tallies with later discussion around the role of race or the questions about, the perennial questions about race and class, right? And why one should be privileged over the other, which is, of course, a misnomer. As Stuart Hall says, race is the modality through which classes live, and we need to think about these things together. But anyway, it's at this time that it was necessary for a white working class to be cohered for the needs of American imperialism. And it's at this time where you get this representation of Tarzan and Jane as emblems, as Robinson puts it, of the Depression era. And they're represented, which is something I'd never thought of until I read it here, as a white couple standing strong in the face of savagery and chaos, right? So in every single episode or every single one of these, because I think it was also serialized as a television series. It wasn't just the movies. Jane needs rescuing from marauding savages and Tarzan comes to the rescue. I mean, that's literally the plot of every single one of them, right? And so this couple is literally this white couple in a sea of danger, of black danger, right? And we need to identify with them. We can't identify with, obviously the people in the jungle. And so Robinson says that race was the film's centering locator. Okay, so race is absolutely intrinsic to how Tarzan and Jane are represented. And this was important because it was at this time that Robinson says that in the early 20th century, a critical time in US history when a new whiteness had to be cohered and to make sense within a national identity in disarray. And this is very important because, of course, this is the time of more mass immigration to the United States and the possibility being held. And of course, this is not just happening in the United States. 1901, Australia is federated. So the various colonies that made up what later became so-called Australia is federated. And the very first act that's passed by the new federal government is what later becomes known as the White Australia Policy. Its official title is the Immigration Restriction Act. And there's an excellent book by the Australian historians Henry Reynolds and Marilyn Lake, name escapes me at the moment, but it's about how this concept of whiteness circulates around the Anglo-settler colonies. And there's a lot of kind of links between how whiteness is used by all of these entities, and indeed a lot of travel between these different locations. So, for example, getting a little bit far away from the topic at hand, but I think it's relevant, a lot of slave owners after the abolition of slavery in North America relocate to Queensland in northern so-called Australia. This is before the Federation, and set up plantations over there. So whiteness becomes very important to how all of these settler colonies kind of identify themselves. But in the United States, differently to Australia, where whiteness places restrictions over immigration, in the United States, immigrants have to be brought into whiteness in order to shore up this national identity, as Robinson puts it, in disarray, because there was no national identity. You had the slave-owning class, and you had Black and Indigenous people, and then you had the sort of, the working class in the middle with no kind of particular allegiance, in order to bring them on side and to shore up power against, not just domestically, but internationally. You had to give this coherence to an American nationalism for the first time, which, presents this kind of coherent whiteness, which instills in people this idea of American nationalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's even more like clear, even in terms of like a promotion of a certain ideal, aspirationally speaking, and domestically, whether it's like the thing about like the old Hollywood productions, and how it's very glaring. I've been really obsessed with those recently, and how it's so glaring, how they're very clearly trying to promote this very specific form of a family structure, and whatnot. And it's fascinating, like, it's how many people like don't see the kind of connection between while it's happening in real time, and how we're seeing today, even how the current media is taking form as well. But yeah.
Oh, absolutely. If you think about the attacks on transgender people and the kind of whole trad wives thing,
yes,
I mean, so much of that has to do with this. And that's why, again, I mean, I don't want to return us to the previous discussion for time, but if you think about this whole idea of wokeness and Disney and woke capitalism, I mean, obviously that didn't take root very deeply. If it's so easy to turn right around back to this very traditionalist, gender normative and white, dominant frame in a matter of a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I kind of think that speaks to like the inadequacy of like the language as well that we're mobilizing to even articulate this stuff as well. It seems as if it's like it's always easily undermined, ultimately. So,
Yeah.
And like
and that's the racial regime, right?
Of course. Yeah. But yeah, I'm gonna shift gears here a little bit. There's a section of the book where you dig into Christopher Rufo. Could you talk a little bit about him and maybe discuss Hisdale College and the Academy of Sciences and Freedom as well? What you see his political movement growing out of?
Yeah, I mean, Christopher Rufo is one of these people when we talk about certain individuals taking it upon themselves to do certain things, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think he, as we discussed earlier, he's an example of that. I write that, he may have fired the first shots in the war on CRT. Who knows what kind of things were being cooked up in, the various institutions he's been attached to. I think we need to be aware that, he's very much this kind of like, villainous character or caricatural villainous character that's being portrayed. But he was working at the right-wing think tank, the Manhattan Institute. In these kinds of think tanks, huge, as we're seeing with Zionism currently and the role of astroturfing within the ADL and other institutions, I mean, enormous amounts of resources are kind of pumped into building these agendas. So I don't want to kind of portray Rufo as being kind of sole trader, right? Obviously, he's part of this larger infrastructure. And, as we're seeing now with Project 2025 and Project Esther, the role of the Heritage Foundation, probably most dominantly and most well known, this has been building over many, many decades, right? And, later on in chapter 3, I discuss, and Robinson talks about this as well, in the context of the 1990s and the attacks on multiculturalism and affirmative action, you have all of these think tanks and lobby groups. The Pioneer Fund, described as a Nazi endowment, for example, playing a massive outsized role in leading to the situation where effectively affirmative action is made illegal, right? So anyway, coming back to Rufo, he's a cog in the wheel as far as I see him, but he is particularly kind of exemplary of this politics. So when he was a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, he comes up with this idea that critical race theory is responsible for everything going to hell in a handcart, basically. And he says, so he first comes on to Tucker Carlson before Carlson became, I think he was fired by Fox News, wasn't he? But when he was still on Fox News and very, I think he was described as America's most watched cable news host. He went on the show and he told Carlson about this research that he'd done, which apparently was him doing these FOI requests into, I think it was the Seattle Office of Civil Rights. And he found that critical race ideology, as he called it, was like written all over. This is his language, right? These kind of Seattle Office of Civil Rights and its policies in respect to anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he says he basically examined the footnotes of these various reports and training manuals, and he found very often references to critical race theory, and particularly the work of the person who's often known as the founder of critical race theory, Derek Bell, the Harvard Law professor, and Kimberly Crenshaw, who's very well known for formulating the idea of intersectionality, although obviously, as I think listeners will know, that very much borrows from earlier ideas developed by Claudia Jones and other Black communist women that people like Charisse Burden-Stelly have written a lot about, but who Crenshaw is a kind of an American Democrat and anti-communist, I think, doesn't really reference that lineage. Anyway, Rufo says that there's this critical race ideology which is writ large across all of these institutions, and he encourages all of these kinds of, he gets the ear of Trump, who says he's listened to him on Tucker Carlson, which leads to Trump passing this executive order to outlaw the use of critical race theory in federal government. And he later pops up in all of these other kinds of iterations, right? So connected ones. So when we spoke about Disney, so Rufo is one of the people who attacks Disney for woke capitalism. And he works together, as you said, with Hillsdale College to develop a manual. I'm trying to find the name of it exactly, but a manual on kind of critical race theory and how to fight it. And he works together, I'm not sure the extent to which they actually work together or they kind of work in tandem, with this person, James Lindsay, who's written several books. He's written a book called Cynical Theories, which came out a few years earlier. And then he later self-publishes this book called Race Marxism, which he says is based on his like extensive research into CRT. He says he's a really crazy guy. He says that he was working 16 hours a day reading all the relevant literature on critical race theory in order to undermine how it's responsible for fomenting nothing short of an anti-racist cultural revolution against the United States, written in capital letters, and other Western nations in the hopes of opening the door to establishing their capital's dictatorship of the anti-racists, right? And he encourages this kind of and this is where it's really important to see Rufo and Lindsay and all these characters as anti-communist, and this use of this kind of, this idea of race Marxism, that what's really at stake here is this imposition of communism through public schools. So Rufo very much encourages this idea that critical race theory is being taught in K-12 education, and using kind of tried and tested techniques of the US right-wing lobby groups. They use things like, school boards and library boards to place astroturfed people kind of posing as activists within them to argue against the use of critical race theory. And this is where you get what looks like a bottom-up movement against DEI and critical race theory within schools and libraries, leading to these book bans and entire revisions of curricula and outlawing of the teaching of African American history, and you name it, or any kind of accurate history of colonization, slavery, and so on. And any mention at all of anti-racism in a lot of states in the United States. This kind of politics advanced by Rufo is very much kind of responsible for this. And later on, just to finish, he pops up again in relation to the attacks on Harvard, specifically the firing, if you remember, the forced resignation of the president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, Rufo says that he basically, very proudly says that he was responsible for working together with Harvard donor Bill Ackman for kind of getting rid of Gay. And the way that they do this, she was a black woman, was to accuse her of having plagiarized her PhD and being only a diversity hire and therefore not adequate to lead Harvard University.
Yeah, thank you. So you discuss how concepts such as critical race theory, woke diversity, equity, inclusion have been mobilized in service of Zionism. So can you just elaborate on that and discuss how that exactly has taken form?
Yeah, so in various ways, and kind of you have two moves, right? You have critical race theory and DEI being used in service of Zionism, and the opposite of that, as I've already alluded, this idea that these are anti-Zionist, race-obsessed kind of institutions or policy frameworks. And these two things often working together, so seemingly contradictory positions, but actually working quite neatly in tandem with each other in very effective ways. And there's a much kind of longer history of this, which we can get into, and is to do with the role of Zionist organizations, particularly the Anti-Defamation League or the ADL, within what we can largely call anti-racism education, going back a really, really long way. And not just the ADL, but other similar kinds of Zionist organizations, trading on the idea of Jews as a racialized minority with historical connections or relations with other racialized minorities, particularly Black people in the United States, in order to gain entry into these structures and to orient education on race in a very, very particular way that ultimately is anti-Black and obviously anti-Palestinian and obviously opposed to any kind of indigenous resistance, and in service of not only Zionism, but also US imperialism. So this is the kind of the backdrop to all of that. But in the current, yes, it's within the current context of the genocide that we see, or this phase of the genocide, we should be more clear to say, that this becomes very, very obvious. And where you have, as I say, and I quoted a tweet from somebody who's called Aditi Rao, who describes being arrested in the Office of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Princeton University, I believe. And so, it becomes very obvious. Some things that just seem completely ridiculous, that we have our critiques of diversity, equity and inclusion, obviously. We know that these are kind of liberal tools to minimize the extent to which race and racial capitalism need to be seen as kind of fundamental to, Western power and so on. And they try to propose that there are kind of piecemeal fixes that can be brought to bear on racism, which is understood as a set of attitudes and behaviors and values, which can be kind of punished, sanctioned, or maybe educated out, or maybe dealt with through kind of intercultural communication between groups who are seen as kind of inherently different to each other in this kind of, typical liberal approach to dealing with racism. But what you have here is this kind of use of DEI to directly police and repress anybody who stands up against genocide and connects that to Western imperialism and the role of the US in supporting the Zionist entity. So critical race theory, like specifically, there's kind of two arguments that kind of, as I said, seem to contradict each other, advanced particularly by Jewish Zionists. And this relates to this idea that, Jews are a racialized minority, that have a particular understanding of racism, etc., as I said earlier. And the two seem to contradict each other. So they go as follows. One is that ethnic studies and critical race studies, such as they are, or anti-racism initiatives in general, particularly in education, are problematic because they exclude the Jewish perspective. They're seen as giving too much time, too much emphasis on the struggles of indigenous peoples, particularly Palestinians, but not only, and not enough time to Jews who are presented as the only racialized minorities whose racism doesn't count, or where the racism against them doesn't count. This comes across in a specious book by a British comedian called David Baddiel called Jews Don't Count, in which he literally argues that, racism against everybody else is taken seriously and the Jews are the only people whose racism, is never taken into account, as though we don't have an entire suite of policies where anti-Semitism is being, seen as portrayed as like the only important and the only form of racism that should be thought about or deserves any kind of attention. So that's one side of the argument, that Jews have been purposefully excluded from ethnic studies. This has led to, guardrails being placed around the ethnic studies curriculum in California by Gavin Newsom, for example. This is in direct response to lobbying from specious Zionist lobby groups within California that have been working for many years, like way earlier than this particular phase of the genocide, to really attack critical ethnic studies because they dared to mention Palestine and to argue that Jews are being just ignored within that whole thing. So that's one side. And then the other side, which weirdly works in tandem, is proposed, for example, by this fellow David Bernstein in his book Woke Anti-Semitism. It's another kind of ridiculous book, in which he argues that critical race theory, by kind of portraying Jews as white or not sufficiently taking into account, racism against Jews, is a form of racism against Jews because it basically targets Jews for critique, because I'm trying to make sense of the argument because it's so stupid in many ways, because it kind of sees Jews as representing capitalism and the state. It critiques Jews as capitalist and as hegemonic, which is in itself racist, if you see what I'm saying. So in a sense, it kind of accepts a racist argument about all Jews as being in positions of power, which is in itself kind of a key feature of anti-Semitism. There's kind of weird circularity going on in that kind of argument. I mean, I could go on. There's so many different facets to that, but that's the basic tenor of it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Josh, you want to ask 9?
I'm just love for you to discuss a bit the history of the ADL and how it came into this role, beginning at least in 1967, of being able to exert, and I'm quoting here, dominance over anti-racism education and policy, leading to it being viewed by legislators and media as an authority on Jewish, Black, Muslim, LGBTQ, immigrant, and other civil rights?
Yeah. I mean, it's important to say that the ADL has been exposed in recent times, leading, for example, just last week, I think it was, to, is it the National Education?
I think National Federation of Teachers, I believe.
Yes, refusing to work with the ADL as more. And Wikipedia already, like a year ago, I think, saying that basically information coming from the ADL is unreliable. And so I think the ADL, although it's a very important history because of its kind of outsized impact on the entire kind of field here, but it's kind of maybe diminishing in its power. But that doesn't mean that the problem is going away, because there is a whole flurry of different organizations that work in a very, very similar way to the ADL. One of the ones that I talk about here is FAIR, which I don't remember what it stands for, but it's something about racism, and they have a whole kind of what they call the Fair Story curriculum, which kind of is rolled out in schools in the United States, which kind of, again, portrays Jews as the main supporters of Black people in their struggle for civil rights, and that therefore there should be kind of an allegiance of Black people with Jews, which literally means that Black people should support Zionism, because this is the subtext for all of this stuff. So, but the history of the ADL is very interesting in relation to the war on anti-Semitism. And I highly recommend the work of Imea Gelman, who's the director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, of which I'm a collective member, along with some other friends of the podcast like Lara Sheehy and Dylan Rodriguez. And Imea's book should be out, I guess, in 2026. It's been submitted. And she's done a long study of the role of the ADL in the United States in relation to Zionism. But yeah, so the ADL is a really old organization which emerged to, I guess, stand up against anti-Semitism. But it particularly comes on the agenda in terms of the things that we're interested in, as you note, in 1967, when, quote, I'm quoting here from Michael Fischbach's book on Black Power in Palestine, the ADL laid into SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for its, quote, pro-Arab, Soviet and racist lines, this is the way they would put it, on what they call the Arab-Israeli conflict. And from 1969 on, the ADL and other Israel-aligned groups played a significant role in using U.S. anti-terrorism law to criminalize Palestinian activists and then to restrict U.S. aid to Palestine. So you're thinking to yourself, what is this organization that's ostensibly about defending Jews from anti-Semitism and doing work in kind of anti-racism education? What's that got to do with anti-terrorism legislation, its role in criminalizing any kind of expression of support for Palestine? I think it's really important to understand. I think it comes together through the critique of the ADL's evolution of the idea of hate speech or hate crimes or the kind of the link between the two, as the dominant way in which racism finds expression, and how hegemonic this has become to a mainstream view of what racism is about. And of course, Dylan Rodriguez has done such important work on this. I think you've had him on to discuss it. And he's also written a very important article about Stop Asian Hate, that movement, and its link to the ADL and other kind of top-down Zionist organizations. But I think, it's really important to understand how much needs to be undone. Not just a matter of saying, we don't trust the ADL's figures, because of course the ADL, it produces these reports on anti-Semitism every year, which grossly inflate the number of anti-Semitic incidents, and most of them are things like, I saw a sticker of a Palestine flag, like 90% of the incidents are there. Of course, the ADL, you remember when Elon Musk did his Nazi salute at the inauguration, the ADL's, what's his name, Greenblatt, I think his name is, he came out and basically minimized what Elon Musk had done and said, it was misunderstood. It wasn't actually a Nazi salute or something like this. So all of these organizations, it needs to be said, are fine and dandy with white supremacists. Like they basically are in bed with all of them. And so when they talk about their anti-Semitic incidents reports, not interested in actual which exists, violent anti-Semitic attacks which have happened, against particular synagogues. They're not very widespread, let's say, but they do exist. There are attacks on individuals and buildings and so on, which are carried out by white supremacists. They're never carried out by Palestinians or Palestinian supporters. That's just a fact. So the things that they say are anti-Semitic incidents are basically things like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or, a Palestine flag or a watermelon. I mean, we have ridiculous situations now where I was in London recently and doctors and nurses are being sanctioned for wearing a watermelon pin at work and things like that, which I'm sure is the fact in the United States as well. So what the ADL has done very successfully over decades, going, as I said, much earlier than this current phase in the genocide, is to instill through its role in anti-racism education that is used, and that's why the members of the National Education, again I can't remember what it's called, had to vote against working with the ADL because its role in education is being so fundamental to roll out this idea that racism is a question of hate and that can be dealt with a carceral approach to hate, which is treated as an individual crime, which can be sanctioned. And we know that what this leads to very often is, and most often, is for, firstly, for it doesn't deal with systemic or institutional racism at all, but it also very often portrays racism as something that can be an act or a set of words that can be done or spoken by anybody. And so if we look, for example, at the wider impact of this, things like legislation around racial vilification, so hate speech, which is an idea that arises from the dominance of groups like the ADL on the entire landscape. When the Racial Discrimination Act and the policy on racial vilification was passed in the Western Australian Parliament, the very first person to be criminalised for hate speech was an Aboriginal teenager because she called a white woman I'm not going to say the word that she used, but for whatever reason, right? Now, obviously, we're in a situation in the settler colony, I don't need to repeat here, founded on the dispossession and genocide of Indigenous people in a settler colony currently where Indigenous deaths at the hands of the state are just growing by the year, where Indigenous children are taken away from their parents systemically in this country. Yet the very first time this law gets used, it's against an Aboriginal teenager for calling a white woman a slur. I mean, this is what this leads to in terms of the very, very practical effects of couching racism in terms of hate. And to bring it back to the beginning, the reason for all of this, the wider kind of political reason for why all of this is happening, is in order for the ADL to be able to have an outsized role, a dominance over the criminalization of any kind of resistance to Zionist power, and to instill in the public, in the US institutions and more widely, this idea that to criticize state power is in itself a form of hate, and to kind of weed out individuals who are resisting Zionism and imperialism as hate mongers who can be criminalized on that basis. And what I'm trying to say is that then has a wider impact beyond the targeting of particular Black radicals and Palestinians mobilizing against Zionism and US imperialism. That has a writ large effect across what can be said across all domains, starting with very early childhood education, when we think about the complete blanket outlawing of any talk on Palestine, not just now, but also historically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know multiple like elementary school, middle school, high school teachers who have lost jobs since October 7th just for, like they wear a kufiya or something like that, and parents cause an uproar and the district just wants it to go away. And obviously they, you end up suing or whatever, but you lose your job and there's no way to, you can't just get it back, and then it's, well, why did you lose? It's bad.
I mean, I think one thing I forgot to say, because I went off on this thing, if I may, it's really important to note, because of this idea that the ADL portrays, and other Jewish organizations portrayed itself as like the people who stood together with Black people when nobody else would, kind of rhetoric, right? When Black people after 1967, openly support Palestine, it's at this moment that the ADL becomes involved in the criminalization of Black radicals, right, in the United States. And where then the only way in which you can discuss racism is in this particular way, and not connecting it up to colonialism and imperialism. So I think it's just important to come back to that, make it clear.
Definitely. And we're going to touch on that with my next question. But no, I do think it's, based on what you're saying, I do think it's fascinating, though, because I'm thinking about even like Derek Bell's concept of racial realism, and how he really gets into like the fold of like civil rights legislation, and how the language they relies on is like very abstract, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of technical language where it leaves things up for interpretation, just enough that like it could be interpreted, or like even like white folks, right, could like claim racism, for example, right? And we're seeing this very same model being mobilized, obviously, in the case of like Jewish folks, right? Like a lot of times, we're like on its face, right? The way the language it is mobilized, you're like, okay, of course, no one wants to hate or shouldn't hate Jews, right? Like it's articulated in a way that is like, again, vague enough that you can interpret it either which way, and even progressives will see it as like a good thing that this is being introduced, and then ultimately it serves a goal of ended up criminalizing anti-racist or radical resistance to Zionist colonialism ultimately. So I always find that fascinating, just how much like, even like civil rights legislation or progressive legislation can end up being mobilized in such a way that it just ends up re-entrenching the state power ultimately.
Well, exactly, because we're seeing this. We're seeing this in relation to how Jews are portrayed, particularly Jews are portrayed as having allegiances to Zionism, and then that becomes a factor of that is their identity, and then it becomes hate speech to say, well, that's not a good position to have.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. No, you're absolutely correct. I totally agree. But yeah, so one of my favorite things about the book was in the section about this phenomena of Afro-Zionism, right? Namely among elite Black Americans, that culminated in the early 20th century prior to the anti-colonial shift after the 1967 war.
Yeah.
And I know, for example, A. Philip Randolph, Ralph Bunche, as well as key figures like Dr. King and Du Bois, held brief, in some cases, long-lasting allegiances to Zionists or to Zionism, ultimately. So before breaking away from it, right, King was stated to visit Israel, if I recall correctly, prior to the war of 1967, which forced a shift. Again, the war itself forced a shift amongst Black folks in the U.S., where they broke away from the Zionist, ideology towards a more shared analogy of oppression, in which Black people rising up in urban rebellions of that year identified more with the Palestinians under our occupation, as you write in the book. So can you talk a little bit about this brief period of Afro-Zionism and how Zionists have been able to mobilize this history and propagate it in service of, their project?
Yeah, I mean, I said a little bit about it before, and I think it's obviously wearing thin now, which is good, but I don't think the problem of Afro-Zionism, or indeed other forms of kind of, for want of a better term, minority Zionism, I don't like that word, but you know what I mean.
Right.
Is still a problem, and in fact a growing problem in many regions, for example, the Pacific, but we can get into that. But this particular history is very interesting because I think it's part actually of the general way in which the right has whitewashed Dr. King specifically, for its use against and using him, as Robin D.G. Kelly has criticized amply, using him in order to project this idea of racial liberalism, where anybody, Black people specifically, who are speaking out against U.S. state racism, racial capitalism, and carceralism, etc., are seen as kind of, refusing to get past the past, just to move on, and refusing to listen to what they say was Dr. King's message, which of course they've completely garbled, that everybody should be treated according to their individual character rather than by, treated by the color of their skin, as if, as if racism can be boiled down to this, to skin color, as we know. So I think, again, there's a particular story about this mythology of Black Jewish alliance, which Baldwin kind of had already poked holes in, a long time before. It is an excellent essay on Black people and Jewish people and kind of the whole question of anti-Semitism and the wider story of how the US kind of repurposes, or the racial regime repurposes, particular figures in a history of the civil rights movement in order to whitewash the crimes of the US state vis-a-vis Black people into the present. And the left in many ways participates in this. And I discussed this in chapter 2 in relation to the attack on Black radical telling of US history. Certain factions within the left also participate in this by kind of building this narrative or pushing this idea that in order to be able to resolve the contradictions of capitalism, we need to put race aside and treat that as something that's kind of in the past. Anyway, just wanting to put this in the wider context, there's this kind of threat almost that Zionists wield over Black people in the United States by constantly invoking this idea of Jewish people as having, again, been the only people who stood by Black people where nobody else was, which is very, very tenuous in terms of an actual history. Of course, there were many Jewish people who were involved in the civil rights movement, and also some Jewish people who were much more radically involved. If you think about, Jewish involvement in the Weather Underground movement, for example, there were some Jewish people, but these are individuals. Writ large, most Jews in the United States were assimilating into whiteness where they could, as most people were. This returns us to our earlier conversation about the need to build up this kind of white nationalist, allegiance among the wider population in order to shore up U.S. imperialism and, the U.S. state against Indigenous people and Black people. So, we need to be fair in terms of the actual history of all of this, but yet this threat is wielded. Zionists are very good at threatening people. This idea that we can take away the support that you need in order to be able to do X, Y, and Z, which completely, attempts to cut off at the knees people's, just their own power and their own existence, as if people can't resist their own conditions themselves, as though they need a kind of a civilizing, the civilizing mission literally in order to be able to do anything. Anyway, Robin Kelly has an interesting article on Dr. King specifically and the potential for him to turn away from Zionism. It's true that not only King, but also Du Bois, professed affiliation for Zionism right up until quite late, right? But I think Kelly discusses because of the way in which Dr. King is kind of being massaged in his particular vision of civil rights that the US state and the elite tries to portray of it, completely missing King's later anti-capitalism. And I think what is shown is that because of the importance of 1967 and the shift that was occurring, not just in relation to Palestine, but also within the United States itself, with the rise of the Black Power movement, that if Dr. King hadn't been assassinated at the time that he was, that there probably would have been a shift. This is what Kelly says, away from Zionism towards an anti-Zionism that was more in line with the Black masses, who saw an affinity between their own condition and, of course, the condition of not just the Palestinian people, but other colonized peoples in other places in the global South. Yeah, I think that's the main thing that I want to say about all this. One thing I guess we could connect it is that it's interesting to see the sort of the continuity of these kinds of politics, particularly in Indigenous politics. And the role, to a certain extent, it's because of Christian Zionism, but not only. A lot has to do with the ways in which particular Zionist organizations, I'm thinking here about Australia, where I'm based, have mobilized around this completely mythical notion of Jewish indigeneity in order to build a bridge to certain Indigenous elites in very kind of worrying ways.
Yeah, that gets into where I wanted to go next. And, it's interesting because there's been discourse around this that I've seen. Like years ago, Mark Lamont Hill hosted he has like I can't remember exactly what the context of it was, but it was a discussion about Palestine here locally in Philly because he lives here, and it was set up, had some good stuff, but he also, you know, Mark Lamont Hill likes to debate, right? So like he had certain things set up of like, okay, well let's
They had a
get this
debate
Zionist.
for Rufo.
Yeah, he'll debate anybody, and I actually, even though I don't like that kind of, I'm glad that he does it. He does it, I don't always agree with him on everything in terms of his arguments and his politics always, but I appreciate him stepping in and, debating around some of these things. But I reference it because I remember specifically a part of this where there were debates between, I think, Susan Abu Hawa and some Zionist about, who was the real indigenous people of Palestine. And so there's been a lot of kind of, maybe it's at the margins, but there's been some weird discourse around Zionism and indigeneity, around Zionism and as like the most successful decolonization movement. I've heard this say from, people who claim that like 1948 represents decolonization and, see Israel as, this is another thing you hear, and you talk about this in the book. Part of the reason I'm bringing this up is you talk about also this notion of Israel as the manifestation of Jewish self-determination, national self-determination for Jewish people, right? And then you also hear versions where people argue that Arabs had colonized Israel, and so then 1948 is the decolonization, right? That's where you get that idea. And then there's also stuff, and you get into the decolonial studies a little bit in the book. You get into some of the indigenous studies and how there are certain Zionist arguments that crop up in these spaces as well. One of the ways, which you also talk about in the book, that this also came up post October 7th, sort of a related thing. It's not quite the same, but people who wanted to bring up Frantz Fanon and say Fanon wouldn't have supported this in response to people sort of also, I can't remember, you cite the person, I can't remember who it was, but she said basically, she's like, what did you think decolonization? Yeah, exactly. And so anyway, I'm just interested in, you critique the limits, or you look at critiques of the limits of the concept of self-determination, which I thought was interesting as well. So in studying these kind of rhetorical tactics and these kind of discourses that seek to muddy the water of decolonization and national liberation as they relate to Palestinians, what were some of the things you came away with that were kind of most important for you in terms of like, what's going on here? What do we need to be aware of with this?
Yeah, so this is like what I do in chapter 4, which is called Capturing Indigeneity, Colonizing Decolonization. And the chapter is relatively complex, I think, because I'm trying to do a few different things at the same time. But what I'm basically trying to look at, I'm trying to think through this concept of Jewish indigeneity to, I'm going to say Palestine, of course they would say Israel, as a kind of a polyvalent or portable or flexible idea that actually can be used in other contexts as well. And the dangers of that, I think that's what I'm really trying to do. And in so doing, it allows us to think about the particular case of Zionism. And as you said, how it can be used or has been used and is being used as exemplary of decolonization. So the exact reverse of what it actually is, right? By making use of this notion of indigeneity and self-determination and decolonization, these three things going together in order to mount that case. And again, to kind of instill confusion and sow chaos, like to return to this idea of the racial regime. And I think it can be seen very clearly in the particular case study that I discuss in chapter 4, which was interesting also because of the convergence in terms of time of these events. So on the 14th of October 2023, Australia held a referendum on the institution of what was called an Indigenous Voice to Parliament. And the Indigenous Voice to Parliament, I won't necessarily get into the whole history of it, you can read it in the book, but it comes out of a process called the Uluru discussions. So discussions of Indigenous elders that were held following a series of regional discussions organised among Indigenous people. It was held at Uluru, this historic, important Indigenous site in the centre of Australia, which led to a signing of what was called an Indigenous Statement from the Heart, which was a statement signed by these Indigenous people who were present at this meeting that asked for treaty, truth, or truth, treaty, and voice in that order. I think it was truth first, treaty, and definitely voice last, right? And so the idea was that first, Australia had to embark on a process of truth-telling about the crimes of colonialism and their ongoing effects. Secondly, a treaty process had to be started between Indigenous nations and the various Australian states. Again, it's a federation. So this is the only settler colony where Indigenous people don't have treaties. And we know about the limitations of treaties. We don't need to get into that. I'm not necessarily advocating here for treaties. I'm just saying what they were arguing for. And lastly, a voice. And the idea of this voice that became solidified after this would be a representative body of Indigenous people that would represent Indigenous affairs to the Australian government. And this was at the time, there was a right-wing government at the time, this was denied. So the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, at the time was opposed to this, and he said, no, we're not going to do this. And then Labour, the Labour Party, in their election campaign before they came into government in 2022, I basically said that, yes, if we get into government, we will make this happen. But the order was reversed. So voice became the first thing, and then truth, and then treaty down the line, right? And the argument was mounted by the Indigenous elites who led this process that this would be a good way to go because Indigenous people would have this voice in Parliament that would represent their interests through the system, right? Anyway, very long story short, the point was that there was significant Zionist involvement in this process. I get into it in the book. There's a particular individual who had been tasked decades before, but in fact by a right-wing Prime Minister, John Howard, who'd governed in Australia for over a decade, who'd led Australia into the war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, very, very right-wing. He said recently in an interview that it was not his experience that racism is a problem in Australia, just to let you know what kind of person he is. Anyway, so this tax lawyer who was the head of the Zionist, basically what do they call themselves? Zionist representative body. Of course, they pretend that they're representing Jews in Australia, all Jews, but they're actually a Zionist body. Mark Liebler, who's a tax lawyer, had been appointed by John Howard already back in the 90s to work on questions of Indigenous affairs. So this person has a long-standing history. Now, the reason that I was interested in this, there's all the kind of ins and outs of his involvement in the Voice to Parliament process. But the reason I'm interested in it is the rhetoric that was used by Zionists to kind of mount their argument. Now, you would ostensibly think that Zionists, as colonizers, would be opposed to Indigenous self-determination, right? But because they mounted the argument successfully that Jews are, successfully in their view, the Jews are Indigenous to Palestine, that creates the bridge of affinity between themselves and Indigenous people who are also Indigenous to this land where they've been treated badly by the Australian state. And what I was particularly interested in this, now what happened with the Voice to Parliament, ultimately it didn't pass because of the success of a racist no vote against it. So the process that led to this Voice to Parliament failing at the referendum is noxious, it's racist, right? But what was written out of the story was a significant opposition to this from grassroots Indigenous organisations or movements, unions, but also ordinary Indigenous people who didn't understand the relevance of this, not in terms of intellectually understand, but they didn't get, what was the relevance of this to their daily life. They didn't see it as something that was going to be any different to any kind of representative body that existed before, because the government was going to hand select the Indigenous people who would sit in this representative body, and also it would be like an advisory body. It wouldn't have any kind of binding effect on what the government ultimately decided to do. So there's a lot of skepticism among ordinary people about this. Now, the reason to come back to the rhetoric that I was interested in this was because this idea of self-determination, which was mobilized quite effectively by Zionists to argue for this indigenous body, also exists and coheres with a particular language which allows institutions, colonial institutions of the state, for example, universities, to whitewash their role in the continuity of colonialism in this particular settler colony. And this is allied to arguments that I make in earlier chapters when it comes to the war on critical race theory and the attacks on Black, Indigenous and anti-colonial thought that, for example, Sylvia Wynter makes about the entire edifice of the humanities and the university writ large, and as she puts it, its textbook industry and so on, in instilling a particular dominant, in the colonial sense or in the racial sense, narrative that imposes a disciplinary, that has a disciplinary function, literally, over knowledge writ large, and therefore orients society in particular ways. And this is where the racial regime comes in, because by using the language of indigeneity and self-determination and embarking on indigenizing processes within institutions, very similarly to, you know, the idea of decolonizing the curriculum and all of that kind of thing, which there was a lot of discussion around, I'm going to say between 2016 and 2022, but kind of demising at this point, you have this ability for institutions to present themselves as involved in self-determination for Indigenous people. The literal expression that's used in the example that I cite is self-determination in Indigenous education, right? Which really made me think, well, what's going on here within the context of a colonial institution, which at the same time is, to link it to Zionism and all of the attacks and repressions that we know that are happening against anybody who speaks up against the genocide. So that the university, for example, so I'm talking about universities because, you know, I work in one, the university using all of its suite of policies, including diversity, equity, and inclusion type policies to police and repress people speaking up against genocide, while at the same time talking about self-determination in Indigenous education. And so you see a literal Zionist logic, which talks about, as you said correctly, Jews as decolonizing, as Indigenous, as self-determining, and all the rest of it, being put into these other colonial, kind of being meshed together with these other colonial structures and being whitewashed by an Indigenous elite working in tandem with the colonial state within kind of a rubric of the politics of representation, which we know very well from long-standing critiques of multiculturalism that Robinson and others and I and many people have written about for decades, are always used as mechanisms of control and rarely are repositories for liberation. So that's kind of the long and short of it, but there's a lot of other aspects. For example, you mentioned the thing about Fanon, which maybe we can take up, you know, in a follow-up if you like.
Yeah, well, that's a lot.
It's a lot. Right? This chapter is my favorite one but it's so, like, there's so many different rabbit holes it goes down.
Absolutely. I want to actually... Yeah, I mean, the Fanon thing, to some extent, I would say, and you do a great job with it in the piece, and, you know, you talk about Abdul Jawad Omar's response, which we discussed with him as well, which I thought was great and, you know, much needed at the time. And then you also had, you know, unfortunately, even Fanon scholars like
Lewis Gordon's, who said Fanon was a Zionist.
Yeah, you know, and I guess his daughter came out and was like, no.
Mireille.
Yeah. But anyway, you know, I mean, it's like a whole episode conversation, maybe multiple episodes about the ways that Fanon is utilized in the academy for all different kinds of, you know, purposes that have nothing to do. And then, as Josh would say, it's like, well, what Fanon are we talking about too? Are we talking about, you know, black skin, white masks, Fanon, or Wretched of the Earth, or, you know, but...
Well, that's Robinson's point in his essay, The Appropriation of Frantz Fanon, that I write about in order to kind of show how this happened at an earlier period. And he's like scathing about black skin, white mask, which I personally think is not very fair. But I think his point is, and his point is that, we get this kind of, foregrounding of the fanon of black skin, white masks, who's kind of like, battling with his sexuality and his relationship to white women and all these kinds of, I don't think that's a fair characterization, but, that's the kind of the version, the psychoanalytic version of fanon that's put forward in seminar rooms and so on, as opposed to the fanon of, the wretched of the earth, etc., and the complete mischaracterization of what he meant by violence, which makes it then possible for certain so-called anti-colonial academics to say that everybody has misread Fanon, and that Fanon is not only, Fanon would be opposed to Fanon al-Aqsa, which is a complete and utter misreading of anything that Fanon has said in that book and elsewhere.
Yeah, I completely agree. So let's close out on this, and then we can, if there's anything else you want to kind of mention as we wrap up, that's great. But, you have this chapter on definitions and on the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And, this is something I think that is quite scary in terms of, what's going on globally right now around how states are using, the IHRA definition and related, laws and policies that they have pushed through. And I think it's an interesting thing because also just thinking about that earlier question of, the inherent weakness of racial regimes. I do think that Zionists have really lost the narrative war around a lot of this globally. We could think about all the people chanting along with Bob Villain at Glastonbury, or the, Palestine Action, prescription, and how the reaction, one, people are chanting along with it. It resonates. There's Palestinian flags all through this festival, but the media, of course, is going overtime, right, to talk about how racist this is, how this was allowed to be on the air. This group try to deplatform them, all this kind of stuff. And so you have this moment where, in many ways, the racial regime, the construction of it is not working. The narratives aren't working, but there's the legal and criminological and state apparatus that is just continues to kind of ramp up and go further and further.
Exactly.
Anyway, that's just a preamble. Let me get into the question I had, because I just got off on my own tangent there. But, one of the strategies, as you write, has been to embed a definition of anti-Semitism in laws across the West. You talk about Germany quite a bit, which I really appreciated, because Germany is one of the places where we see this kind of most starkly because of also the history of the Holocaust and the way that they have dealt with that history and what policy positions they've decided to take as constitutive of what their nation state is in a post-World War II setting. You caution against the idea that this is a weaponization of anti-Semitism. So I also want you to talk a little bit about that, because it is, I think, on some level, it's warfare through the language, through this terminology and these definitions. But talk a little bit about all of this, all of what I've laid out.
So the chapter is called Against Definitions, but it's doing something a bit more than that. So in the sense that the chapter is kind of divided into two parts. And the first one one of my basic contentions is that with all of the talk about anti-Semitism, there's actually no interest in the history of anti-Semitism, nor in actually combating anti-Semitism from the states who are currently repressing us for standing up against genocide via the tool of anti-Semitism. Okay? And so the first part of the chapter tries to think through what is at stake, how do we understand, historically speaking, the role of anti-Semitism as a European phenomenon with very precise historical features which are complex and multiple, and also not consistent over time, right? The role of that for the current conjuncture, right? So the argument is that we actually, from our perspective, because I think, if I may say, on the left, and I completely understand this, there's fatigue around talking about anti-Semitism, but that kind of goes against our own interests, I think. And one of the things I've been discussing, for example, you probably know his work, the pro-Palestine Irish barrister Frank McGuinness, is the need to talk about and to study anti-Semitism in order to be able to understand how it's being manipulated or how it's being used in the current time. So I think, but there's a lot of fatigue around it as well. So my argument is not here to say, oh, anti-Semitism has to be taken seriously, it's so important and all the rest of it. My argument here is to think through what is the function, what is the political function of anti-Semitism, and to try to situate that in the history of European racial capitalism, building on Robinson's discussion of Marx's essay on the Jewish question. I don't want to get into it in too much detail here, but just to make clear where I'm coming from. And I think what we're seeing, and this relates to your question about warfare and anti-Semitism in warfare, is that we need to see the whole idea of Jewish safety as a rhetoric of war. So my argument is one that goes, that also, and Jewish safety can be best understood in terms of an idea that I picked up from Siddhant Isar and his colleagues in this brilliant essay on the primitive accumulation of whiteness. They build on Rosa Luxemburg's analysis of primitive accumulation to think about the kind of the recursive nature of primitive accumulation. At the same time, we can use this analogy, or we can use this way of thinking about things in relation to Jewish safety. So there's this kind of primitive accumulation of Jewish safety in relation to the politics of anti-Semitism that then becomes hegemonic about how we think about racism generally. And I've written about this in previous work, where anti-Semitism is kind of laid out as the prototype or the blueprint for all forms of racism. And the Nazi genocide is the prototypical example of what, the teleological kind of culmination of racism or race thinking looks like. And that anything that doesn't come up to a white European standard of what that is said to be, imposed by Zionism in a particular approach, like we know about, Israeli ambassadors to the UN going in there with this yellow star and saying that anybody who speaks out about genocide is basically reenacting the Holocaust, all this absolutely ridiculous stuff, that this is used rhetorically again and again and again. And that the issue is not so much, and this can be seen very clearly in the German case, is not the much touted European guilt or specifically German guilt for the Holocaust. That's more rhetorical, because actually if people have canvassed the German population, and most people are actually pro-Palestine, and they can separate between the Holocaust and what's happening. And in fact, not separate, but in fact, relate what's happening currently, what Israel is doing currently, to the history of the Nazi genocide and other German genocides before that. They can relate these things, but what you have is this hegemonic need to reinstill this idea that the European mission is to uphold or to protect Jews who are inherently and perennially at risk of genocide. And this idea becomes, central to a particular vision or a particular mission that Western civilization has set itself, which is one today, but also in the past, which is based on the need to constantly assert its dominance. And in a sense, Jews, not as actual people, but as a kind of a chimeric figment, are being put forth as a shield in front of Western civilization, as the rhetorical tool that's being used to shore up Western power against anti-colonial resistance, which is ongoing. And as you said correctly, in relation to Glastonbury, etc., and all of the other outpouring of support for Palestine around the world, particularly in the global south, is obviously being refuted and exposed by the majority of people in the world. So then there's this need to impose this from on high. And I'm arguing that this notion of recursive primitive accumulation helps us to understand, as Robinson says in relation to his discussion of Marx's essay on the Jewish question, the way in which none of this is actually about Jews, but rather the function that the Jews had at the time of Marx's writing for German society, and more broadly, if we zoom out from that, for the West in general, right? So Jewish safety has a function for the protection or the struggle for survival of Western civilization. And once we understand that, then I think all of the other things fall into place. That's why it's so extreme, this repression, I think, because the West, there's an inherent knowledge of its complete criminal nature, its destructive and anti-human nature, right? So to relate this to the question of definitions, what I then try to do is to think, well, not just the IHRA definition, but also other definitions of anti-Semitism that have been proposed as alternatives to it, and to think, what is the function of all of this? What is the function of all of this? And I've used, both in this chapter and also in chapter 3, the extremely useful concept theorized by the Palestinian scholar Anna Yunus, which he calls the war on anti-Semitism. And Dylan Rodriguez also has talked to you about this in terms of like lexical warfare and so on. And there's a difference, I think, between this and weaponization, because when people say anti-Semitism has been weaponized, what they mean is that there's this kind of fake form of anti-Semitism used by Zionists that's being counterposed or is masking the real form of anti-Semitism. And that doesn't really get to the heart of, because like, who knows what the real form of, if we're thinking with the racial regime constantly refreshes, recalibrates, responds to context, time, location, etc., right? And therefore, so there's not something that you can set in stone and say, look over here, this is the real thing, and over here, that's the fake form. So I don't think, and I think this is a consequence of the lack of interest in the history. And it's not just lack of interest, it's also the purposeful top-down determination to completely hide the history of actual anti-Semitism from view, and to present this idea that for millennia, Jews have been attacked everywhere and anywhere they go. So this idea, by the way, the ADL was absolutely fundamental to this, I should have mentioned before, this idea of the new anti-Semitism, which they came up with in 1970 in this book, that, old anti-Semitism of the European variant that was led to the Nazi genocide, well, that's all done with, but this new anti-Semitism is actually coming from the global south, and particularly Arabs, right? So, this is the point, that there's this kind of, this hegemon. So we're never given the actual history of anti-Semitism. So actually, when we say real and fake or real and weaponized, we don't know what we're talking about, right? Because we've never been able to see, what anti-Semitism is doing politically because of all of this rhetoric on top of it that's being imposed by Zionism, and also the overlay of the Nazi genocide as everything that you need to know about anti-Semitism, or indeed about Jews, right? There's no interest in actually. So this is why I think that Yunus's concept of war on anti-Semitism gets to the heart of the matter much better. And she does this really well, I think, by seeing the war on anti-Semitism consequently, or, in the same logic as the war on drugs and the war on terror. So as we understand that basically, that these are kind of elite manufactured crises, right? And the idea of, drugs being this massive problem particularly in the Black community in the United States, and therefore being responded to with a carceral approach that leads to mass prison building, etc. We know that this is part and parcel of the entire attack on Black radicalism that began much earlier, etc. And then we know that the war on terror, this idea that Muslims have to be dealt with as always already potential terrorists, is done in order to instill, basically to cover over for the West's ambitions in the Middle East and so on. We know all of this kind of stuff. And so when we think about, that's why I think her idea of thinking of anti-Semitism as a war in line with these logics is very apt, because it helps us to see the extent to which this is not about any kind of objective fight against anti-Semitism. And it exposes the degree to which this is a tool of repression that goes beyond the needs of covering over a genocide. Because this is a thing that people, I think, that can be seen everywhere and people are paying attention to, that once these laws are laws and policies of universities, like, for example, the changes to codes of conduct that universities have made in light of the encampments and so on. Once these things are in the books, they're in the books, right? And then they can be used in all kinds of ways, right? As we saw earlier with hate crime, the example I gave about racial vilification and so on and so forth. So this is why it's really important at this point to not fall into this trap. And this is building on the critique of Palestinian scholars like Mohanad Ayash and Samir Abdul Noor, who I quote both of them, who've been very critical of the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was an alternative to the IHRA that was put forth by a group of critical Zionists, let's say. I mean, some of them are anti-Zionist, and some of them have moved away from their support for the JDA, like Barry Trachtenberg, for example, is one of those people. But many of them are Israelis working within Israeli institutions who are Zionists, and others who basically want to temper the IHRA, but not abolish it, right? To to still work with this idea that we require definitions of anti-Semitism within institutions. And my argument radically, and I'm interested, it's been gratifying to me that many people have gone in this direction themselves, like independently to what I've written, that there's a real problem with allowing institutions to define our oppression in any kind of way. And this is why I take a position against the request for institutions to define anti-Palestinian racism, for example, which is something that has risen in recent times, which I get. Like, I understand why you say, well, if you're going to impose this definition of anti-Semitism on me, I want you to recognize that there's such a thing as anti-Palestinian racism. I get it. But my point is to say, not that we don't require definitions. We do. Like, we need to define things. We need ways of conceptualizing things in order to be able to understand the world around us. But again, coming back to the idea of the racial regime, this is in constant flux, right? So, and once you request an institution that is involved in sanctioning and punishing you to recognize the way in which you're being oppressed and to set that in stone, I think you've given over too much power. So you don't retain the power of definitions for yourself and for your people, but you give it over to institutions to be the arbiter of what constitutes that. And with all the repression, when we come back to being arrested in the office of DEI, right? That's what it then comes back to. And the very last point is that I use this brilliant essay, The First Attack is an Attack on Culture by Cedric Robinson, in which he discusses Marx's essay on the Jewish question in relation to the need of African Black radical intelligentsia to eradicate the idea of the Negro, as he put it, which is the attack on culture that is required in order to go forth in the anti-colonial era, because the idea of the Negro, as he also discusses in the first chapter of Forgeries, is in order to entirely kind of cover over and deny the very rich and variegated histories of African peoples and to surmise everything, this representation of them as this kind of downgraded, dehumanized idea of the Negro. And so that's what he meant. We have to reject the terms that are imposed on us by, powerful bodies, including institutions such as universities, and to define our own terms, right? And I end with arguing for an abolitionist approach to all forms of definition as a kind of a countering to the war on anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that, as you're talking about it, I'm thinking about is, a number of people, and I think you probably made this point earlier in this discussion as well, but that a lot of, when we really think about racism and what is most important within it, right? It's kind of like state institutional capitalist power to be able to exact consequences on people based on characteristics that they define in certain ways, right? And, that's one of the things I think that has been, like, I read, shout out to Renee Johnston on Saturdays with Renee, but she was like, hey, Harvard has these reports, like, come read them with me and we'll do an episode on it. And, so I joked that she made me read the reports because I really didn't want to read them. But they were very interesting because, so there was one on anti-Semitism and it was worded as like anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli bias. And the other one was worded as like anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and anti-Palestinian bias, something like that, right? That's important because they're moving between different, like they're talking about Israeli as having a protection based on nationality too, which is an interesting thing that I'm starting to see a little bit more. It's kind of a way to get around protection of Zionists to some extent, although now they are moving to do protection for Zionists, which is a really interesting thing too. But the thing that was so obvious to me in reading these reports was that one report, the anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, was filled with all types of very real material consequences that these students, faculty, staff were facing, whether it was losing their jobs, not getting tenure, not getting promoted, or just dealing with the effects also of having family members killed in Gaza and having no institutional resources to support them, There was a stabbing that's referenced that like the school doesn't acknowledge happened, but sort of reference that, oh, multiple people talk about this Muslim student who was stabbed, but nobody knows, So it was like, and that was recited by like students and faculty. I don't know if it was a true thing or not, but it was a real, it was something that was, you could triangulate as at least multiple people thought that it had occurred, right? As well as like the targeting and following of Muslim students, students who wear hijab and things like this, right? I know you're familiar with all this because you work on a campus and all these things are going on, But then in the other one, the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel, it's not that none of what came about, some of the things that came about probably were crossed some kind of line into something that probably is anti-Semitic. But it was based on like how people felt, and it was based upon sometimes interpersonal exchanges that folks had with folks that didn't have institutional power over them ultimately.
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece for me. It's why I think the definition point that you make is an important one, because that is like, it's the codification of it's a way that the institution codifies its institutional power, and it can use that as things morph over time in a lot of ways. And it's even why, I know that Mamdani has talked about supporting like hate crimes stuff, and he makes these certain kind of moves where he's trying to court certain voters, I think, of trying to say we need to have a real conversation around anti-Semitism. And, that's why I support money for this certain hate crime, program or whatever. And it's like, maybe has some really slick idea of how that's going to work, but I think it's going to be really bad if that actually happens, so.
Yeah. And I mean, we have an example of it here in Australia, because at the beginning of the year, the end of last year and the beginning of the year, there were a spate of quote unquote anti-Semitic attacks, which ended up being hoaxes. The police, even at the time, said this one particular thing, I won't get into the details because it's too boring, but basically a caravan full of explosives that was conveniently found in a particular location with notes in the caravan said with like, here's the address of the synagogue. Like it was child's play, right? And the police even at the time said, this doesn't look quite kosher, right? Nonetheless, a massive furore about it, and which led to very, very quickly the passing of very, very repressive anti-protest laws, particularly in New South Wales, the state that I live in. And I was critical of a progressive Jewish organization, and I received a lot of pushback for this, but a lot of support also, because they immediately jumped on the bandwagon, very similarly to what you're saying that Mamdani has done, to say, we decry this anti-Semitism and we need to support the government in, this kind of hate crimes direction, but at the same time have some human rights checks and balances over it, right? And as somebody who had signed their principles when they first emerged, this organization, I publicly said I was resigning from my support for them for these reasons, because of the very fact that we know, to return to the earlier point, that the ways that these repressive mechanisms are used never do the job that they say that they're going to do, right? They're never actually going to target quote unquote real anti-Semitism, with all the caveats that we have already spoken about around that, right? But they're always going to lead to give the government further tools to repress any kind of dissent, but not just dissent related directly to the genocide, but also will apply, because they have done historically, and there's no reason to think that they won't do in the present, will apply disproportionately to Indigenous people and to Muslim people, who are the two groups, along with asylum seekers, who are the most at risk of actual racist violence by the state and popular violence in this country. Because, as I say earlier on in the book, there is vigilante violence, murderous violence against Indigenous people, which led, for example, to the death of to the killing of a 15-year-old. Only a few weeks ago, his killers were, found guilty and so on. But the point is that we know in this colony that this is what any kind of repressive instrument leads to. And for progressive organizations who are critical, if not, entirely anti-Zionist, but very critical of Zionism, to come out and frankly, whether or not these incidents had been hoaxes or not, they shouldn't have jumped up and to support these hate crimes legislation. And it kind of reveals a lack of knowledge of the history of institutional racism, and a lack of responsibility. And, as I said, there was pushback against me, but I think it's necessary. And I think there'll be pushback against this, my critique of institutionalizing definitions of anti-Palestinian racism, which I understand even where they come from. But I nonetheless think that it's important to make them, because there are other mechanisms, other means that we can use as people to fight against Zionism. And we don't need to turn to the colonial institutions and the racial state to do that work for us.
I don't know if there's anything else that you want to kind of share, either from the book or other stuff that you're involved in or working on right now. It's been great to be back in conversation with you, Alana, and to talk about this book. I'm sure that folks that pick it up will get a lot out of it, as we did. And you also get a lot of references to great Millennials Are Killing Capitalism episodes in the footnotes and the bibliography. So anyways, anything else you want to say in closing? This has been great.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks for giving me so much time. I mean, as you're kind of probably tell from the way the conversation has gone, there's a lot of different aspects to this. And it was very challenging to bring them all together. I hope somewhat successfully. I mean, so far with conversations with people who I really admire, who've read the book, like H.L.T. Kwan, obviously Elizabeth Robinson, who wrote the foreword, Dylan Rodriguez, Charisse Bradenstelli, people who've endorsed the book. That gave me a lot of confidence to say, something is working here, because it's actually very tricky. I said to multiple people when I was writing this book, I am never doing this kind of work again, where you're trying to analyze. Like, I'm going to become a historian. I can't actually do this anymore. It's so difficult to analyze things that are happening in front of your eyes. And I want to say this because this is my 5th book, and people say, oh, you must, you know what you're doing. I said, every single work that I do, I feel it gets harder. Because I think the more you know, or the more you're exposed, the more information you're exposed to, or the more knowledge you're exposed to, the less, in fact, you are certain, which is as it should be. And so it becomes harder. But definitely the work that you're doing has been, I don't think I could have written this book without your platform, because you provide a means to parse what's happening in the present. Because unfortunately, we so often have to wait, often years, for things to appear in books in order to be able to have an understanding. And yes, it's important sometimes to not respond immediately and to have some, to have the opportunity to look back on things that have happened in order to understand the present. But I do think that the two things have to work in tandem. And what you give all of us is kind of the opportunity for really, really smart people to sit down and to literally to respond to something that happened yesterday, and to put it together with all the knowledge that they already have. And yeah, that's just been massively, massively beneficial. So my thanks is really to you. And, go on with power in everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's been great to really be in, intellectual community with you over the last couple of years. And yeah, I mean, I think the book is great and does a lot of things. And I agree, it's really hard. I mean, I know many times that I look back at stuff we said a year or 2 years ago or whatever, and I'm like, oh my God, like, how did I think that, or how was that my interpretation of what was going on at the time? So yeah, it is difficult, but I do think it is important to always, to have these conversations and to try to make our way through these things, because we don't have that, we live in this world, and we don't have the time to just sit back and wait 5 years for somebody to explain it to us.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
It has.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.